This session is set up as a debate, one of the few debates we're having for the Friedman Conference this year. And I've decided to chair it because it's a debate that I care nothing about, so I'm going to be thoroughly impartial. It's a Republic-Monarchy debate, which sounds like something we've done before, but we decided to add a twist and look for a few alternative views within the boundaries of Republican monarchy. So we're going to start the talk with the status quo and steadily go with speakers promoting things further away from the status quo. So we're going to have, as you would expect, the constitutional monarchy, represented by Satya from the ATA. Then, I believe, Dr. Peter Rodi from UTS will be talking about switching to a Republican model with an appointed head of state, which is basically the debate we had back in '99, for people who can remember that referendum. And this room should have people who can remember it, because if you can't remember it, you're supposed to be in that room. So, again. After that, we're going on to the third alternative, which was debated a lot back in '99 as well, as the direct elected president of a republic. And that will be represented by the Honourable Dr. Peter Phelps. Two Peters, two Republicans, coincidence? Probably, but... and that's the debate you've heard already. And then we decided to have a fourth option. We had two Republicans, so we needed another monarchist position. So we've got Matt O'Donnell from the CIS representing the position of absolute monarchy. Or I suspect perhaps something closer to anarcho-monarchism. But anyway, so hopefully that'll be a bit of fun. So to get this rolling, I'd ask you to please welcome Satya Marar to the stage.
Okay, just to, I guess, contextualize the whole monarchy versus republic debate in this country, I want you to imagine something for me. So you're in the shower, and the water is perfect. It's just hot enough. It's got a little bit of cool to it, so you're not burning, and the water's rushing down your face. It's been working so well for so long. Everything's going perfectly fine. Suddenly, a big, hairy man with a bandana comes running into the shower, grabs the cold knob, turns it all the way up, and says, "This isn't good enough." That's exactly how this debate is happening in this country. Not metaphorically, literally. Okay, that's a hyperbole, but anyway. Look, the point is, we have a system that's functioned perfectly well throughout this country's history. It's a system that promotes stability. It's a system that pays tribute to our past and to our cultural origins of many of our institutions that we often take for granted. And it pays tribute to our history. And in a day and age when we are a multicultural society, when we are a multi-ethnic society, we come from many walks of life, it actually is worth paying tribute to that. You know, we have Harmony Day, we have NAIDOC Week, you know, we have all these occasions when we pay tribute to all the various elements of the tapestry that makes up, you know, our country, and that's beautiful. Why can't we pay tribute to the origin of our Westminster Parliament, you know, our liberal democracy, our common law legal system? And, you know, we talk about rights and liberties. I mean, these things didn't come from nowhere. I mean, yes, we believe in natural, inalienable rights. But that idea didn't originate in a pamphlet from Thomas Paine from the 1700s. No, it actually began culturally with the Magna Carta, which is a British document from the medieval times. I mean, if someone like me who makes fun of the UK all the time, you know, their dental care is absolutely terrible, their accents are hard to understand, even though they invented the language. They keep coming up with sports which we just seem to absolutely kick their ass at every single time. And you need a license to carry a knife or something. Or that's what I heard from reading the memes. But, you know, the fact is, through all of this, there has been an enduring institution that pays tribute to a time when the UK was great. And thankfully, that's the one element of the UK we've kept, right? So since the 1980s, we have been functionally independent from the UK. All we've done is we've kept this independent umpire, this mascot, the Queen, who plays no direct role in our political affairs. No one knows what she thinks of what goes on here. By all accounts, she probably doesn't give a shit about what happens here, right? She's just there in her role with her responsibilities to uphold the rule of law. And the one time she intervened was in the 70s when Gough Whitlam was about to bankrupt the country. And she only intervened on the advice of the Governor General, who was on the ground able to see what was going on. I want to actually contrast two situations. So India is often given as an example of a republic where the president is appointed. And by and large, it seems to function fairly well, right? Well, in the 1970s, Indira Gandhi, the then Prime Minister of India, pressured the head of state of India the president who she had appointed, or who the parliament had appointed, to give her an emergency decree in an era known as the emergency, giving her power to rule directly for a temporary period of time. And what followed were a ton of extrajudicial killings, tortures, mass sterilizations. No, that's not funny. It's actually quite horrible. Why am I laughing? But the point is, that would not happen here. It is far more likely to happen with an appointed president or even an elected president, because it can happen under an elected prime minister, right? This is about having constraints on the power of our elected representatives. Because what happens when you have an elected position? It's a political position. It's a position of personal glory. It's a position that you go into thinking, I'm going to leave my stamp and my impression on what I'm going to do. I'm going to use my position to sell my agenda. People are going to remember me. They're going to validate me. The fact is, the Queen, Prince Charles, they don't ask for your validation, right? If we voted tomorrow to become a republic, they will keep completely quiet. They will never raise their hand up and say so much as, oh, well, I think I do a pretty good job. Why don't you want me? They'll never do that. Our politicians, meanwhile, can you imagine a President Turnbull, a President Hanson, Can you imagine a President Yasmin Abdel-Majid up high in her ivory minaret, lecturing us about how horrible the patriarchy is on Australia Day? It's an absolute nightmare. It almost makes you want to throw up, We're meant to have a head of state who is politically neutral. And there's only one institution that is under sufficient pressure to truly remain politically neutral. And it is backed by over 500, 600 years of solid tradition, duty, and responsibility. They say that Prince Charles might actually be an environmentalist in his private views. He might be a bit of a hippie, He might be someone who many of us in this room disagree with on many of those issues. But what's important is he keeps his mouth shut for the most part, right? He will never dictate to us how we should live our lives, because he understands that when he speaks, he's not simply speaking as an individual or as a man. He's speaking for the institution of the monarchy, the institution of the Prince of, what's his title? Yeah, Prince of Wales, right? Yeah. And the only way to ensure that independence, to ensure that neutrality that makes our system function so well, is to keep it a hereditary position that has symbolic roots in our history, right? What values do the monarchy actually promote? If they do promote some neutral values, well, it's not actually a static institution, it's a dynamic institution. It evolves with our culture. To give you an example, Prince Harry and Prince William have fought on the battlefield alongside Australian diggers. The first, British royals to do that in over 500 years, to fight alongside the soldiers actually on the battlefield. He recently married an American divorcee, a self-made actress who came from modest circumstances, who is a multiracial person. We threw a royal wedding party recently, the Australian Monarchist League. And not to toot my own horn, but we had about 70 people packed into the room, organized in the span of a few days. The oldest person in the room was 30. The average age was like 25, around my age. So it still has a lot of cultural relevance for our society, and people genuinely appreciate it in this day and age. So I guess to recap, you have an appointed or an elected president, it becomes an individual role. They're susceptible to political pressure because the people who appointed them, whether it's a populist section of the electorate, whether it's a section of your parliament who appointed them, put them under political pressure. The one time the Queen has actually intervened, she made an unpopular decision, but a tough decision and a decision that had to be made. And because she's so independent, the Governor-General was able to give her that advice and carry on, knowing well that he wasn't going to be lynched by the person who appointed him. And that's what makes the system so great. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Let's keep what we have. It's pretty damn good, right? If you can understand that McDonald's functions on two pillars, the CEO who directs the company and Ronald McDonald, the mascot. He embodies the values that make McDonald's so great. Childhood joy, free toys, consumerism, obesity, monosodium glutamate, all the things that make McDonald's so great, right? What is there stopping McDonald's from appointing a CEO who's like a hardcore radical feminist, social responsibility warrior, who comes out saying, okay, our product is pretty bad, and now what we're going to do is we're only going to manufacture kale smoothies. McDonald's is now a kale smoothie company. They'd have to give up the mascot too, because Ronald McDonald does not stand for that. He's a mascot for what made the company so damn great. And the Queen is the mascot for what makes Australia so damn great. And it's not worth sacrificing that. If I, as an immigrant from another country and another culture, can recognize this indelible fact, then surely everyone in this room can as well. So, thanks.
Thank you, Satya. That was very interesting. Just to remind you, you can ask questions at the end of this, but only through the Hoover app. We're no longer handing a microphone to everyone because we know you just give statements disguised as questions. But if you want to ask a question, go to the Hoover app and you can put in the questions now, and at the end we'll call them out. So before going on to Dr. Peter, before that we have to invite Dr. Peter to speak. I'd like to give Dr. Peter Rody a proper introduction, but I can't understand anything that he works on, some quantum physics. That'll really help me, yes. But anyway, please give warm welcome to Dr. Peter Rody.
Thanks very much. So I want to begin with a thought experiment. Imagine that our head of state was not in any way accountable to the United Kingdom, but was accountable to any other nation on earth. Would we feel the same way about the monarchy? And I think the answer is no. If our head of state was somehow, through whatever miracle, allied with China, there would be absolute uproar. And why? For very obvious reasons. We can't have a representative of our nation having allegiances to foreign countries. Now, in the context of the UK, where our current monarch comes from, we all feel fine about it because we've historically had very good relations with the UK. Our interests have generally converged. We've never been on bad terms. We have a very special friendship, and I certainly hope it stays that way. But the world is very rapidly changing, and we can't guarantee that it's always going to stay that way. Geostrategic interests can change overnight very easily, and so we can't rely on the fact that we can always trust our best friend. We need to internalise this and come up with a representative who is truly Australian and accountable to no one else. Now, we don't even allow our MPs to have foreign citizenship, dual citizenship. Even if they're wholly Australian citizens, we don't allow them to be MPs if they have a foreign allegiance simultaneously. If the Queen, by that measure, is not eligible to run for Parliament in this country, why is she permitted to be our monarch, our head of state? And I think the answer is that it's absolutely absurd. If the Queen is ineligible to be an MP, she certainly shouldn't be eligible to be our representative. So that's the standard argument that you'll hear all over the place. I didn't make that argument up. You've all heard that before. I just wanted to summarise it because I think it's relevant, but it's not the real reason why I'm opposed to the monarchy. The real reason I'm opposed to the monarchy is because the Queen and her cronies in the royal family are pathological doll-bludgers. And I think that this is a really bad example for society, and in particular for our children. Now, you speak to young kids, 5-year-olds. It's very common for the young girls, when asked what you want to do when you grow up, they'll say, I want to grow up and be a princess. These kids' minds have been so infected that they aspire to be high-functioning, high-profile doll-bludgers for the rest of their lives. This is the infection of their minds that our current system is creating. We don't need a head of state who is a doll-bludger and advocates for themselves. We need a head of state who advocates hard work, entrepreneurship, self-responsibility. And for that reason, when we choose our head of state, it should be an Australian who's being rewarded for a lifelong commitment to building this country and making it a better place. As far as I'm concerned, if you're on welfare, you should be ineligible to hold a head of state position in this country. But the monarchy doesn't stop at that. They go further. They use their power to influence government to try and lobby for more welfare. But not welfare for the great good, not all the poor starving people, welfare for themselves. We don't have enough hundreds of millions. The fact that the monarchy costs the British taxpayer more than $500 million a year, well, they still complain that they need more. As far as I'm concerned, these are doll-bludgers who have claimed hundreds of millions of dollars in entitlements, despite being able-bodied and able-minded and capable of working. And I think it's time we introduced work for the dole to make them pay back their past receipts off the British welfare system. And my back-of-the-envelope calculation estimates that they owe about 100 million man-hours of work to the Work for the Dole program. So as far as I'm concerned, give them a shovel and let's get things going. There is only one good thing about the monarchy, and that is that this incredible income that they have is tax-free. And I think that's a very worthwhile cause to advocate for, but they should be advocating for it for everybody else in society, not just for themselves. These should be our low-tax advocates. So that's half of the argument. The other half of the argument is not why am I opposed to the monarchy and in favour of a republic, but why this particular model of an appointed president as opposed to an elected one? Yeah, I think it is. I just need to be a bit closer. So consider this situation where we have a directly elected president, but our Prime Minister, as always, is not directly elected. This could lead to a really serious crisis in people's perception of who has authority in the country and lead to a crisis in the power hierarchy. Suppose hypothetically that there's a really, really polarising issue, something like the recent gay marriage debate, something that cuts society in half and people are really passionate on both sides, and it cuts society 50-50. And now imagine that the Prime Minister and the elected President had different personal views on this issue, and they expressed those views. What inevitably would happen is that all the people supporting the President's side would stand up and say, well, our President was directly elected. He has more democratic legitimacy than the Prime Minister. And this would polarise society and tear us apart. And I think that could lead to very, very unstable political conditions. So inevitably what would happen is the President's supporters would claim the moral high ground because he's directly elected, the Prime Minister is not, and there's the source of the problem. If it's appointed, on the other hand, there's no challenge to the legitimacy of the President or the Prime Minister. So in conclusion, if you support the monarchy, you support the welfare state in its absolute most perverse form. And I think it's completely incompatible to be a monarchist and a libertarian, if you want to call yourself that. Why? Because the royal family have monopolised the welfare state, cornered the market, and take most of the proceeds for themselves and do no advocacy for Australia whatsoever. Thank you very much.
All right, well, this is a lot more fun than I thought it would be. Thank you for that, Peter. And next up, we have Dr. Peter Phelps, the one, the only, the always popular, to tell us about a directly elected republic position.
Thank you. Hello. The very problems which Peter identifies are in fact the virtues of a directly elected presidential system. Because when you ask ourselves, what do we value in government? Assuming we want government in the first place, but what do we value in it? Well, it's more of a negative argument, and that is we don't want our governments to be tyrannical. We're happy if they do nothing. We're happy for inaction, but we don't want them to be tyrannical towards us. How do we achieve that? You achieve that by the diffusion of power to the widest extent possible, which is why you have federal systems with clear separations of powers, and why you have bicameral parliaments or congresses. But let's take that one step further and say that the executive and the legislature should be separated entirely. So I'll go through each of the arguments which will be made today. Absolute monarchy. Well, it's an interesting and highly efficient way of governing, although it does tend a little towards the side of a lack of accountability, although, of course, the Russian monarchy was noted as being absolutism tempered by assassination. Appointed, you can appoint your mates under the system which was applied. So the ability for the executive to have any real constraining influence over an out-of-control legislature may not be so successful. Never forget that, of course, John Kerr was appointed by Gough Whitlam on the basis that, as a good old-fashioned Labor lawyer, it was assumed that he wouldn't create too much trouble. Constitutional monarchy, there are some issues there, but essentially they have the same problem which we face under the Westminster system. And this is the problem of politics in the Westminster system. The conflation of the executive and the legislature. You have a situation where the legislature provides all the people who make the effective decision-making power in the executive. What does that mean? It means there's no genuine oversight of the executive. And it's often been said, and I think quite truly, that a situation like Watergate were to happen in Australia simply wouldn't have happened. Why? Because you didn't have a Senator Howard Baker, a Republican, actively cross-examining the executive as to what their actions and motives were during that situation. When you have an executive which is drawn from the legislature, you fall into a situation where the legislature, or those who are ambitious in the legislature, have to play the game. Don't cause trouble, don't make waves, don't be too intelligent, and one day, don't be too threatening, and one day the leader, the Prime Minister or the Premier, will move you up into the ministry. Because at that stage, you will have your ability to, and it's very attractive, because then you'll have the ability to exercise executive power. Because under the current system, there is no power in the monarchy, and there's no power in the monarch's representatives, either at a state or federal level, other than the plenary power of removal, which is only exercised, and indeed has only been exercised twice in the entire history of Australia, once at a state level and once at a federal level. So if you don't have the executive being effectively oversighted by the legislature, what do you have? Well, you have what you have in New South Wales, and to a lesser extent federally, you have a tyranny of the executive. You have a tyranny of the executive which is only ameliorated by the occasional bits of judicial intervention to stop the executive from interfering with the lives of people. Now, in theory, under a Westminster system, you should have a fair degree of oversight of the executive by the legislature. But you have what I call the Solomon Islands situation. You have to remember, when George Reid was Premier of New South Wales, he had a cabinet of 11 people in a parliament which was larger than the contemporary parliament today. So the number of people in parliament was much larger than it was today, but he only had a cabinet of 11 people. What you have is what the Solomon Islands have, more and more, and that is Solomon Islands has got a single unicameral legislature of 50 people. One of those is the Prime Minister, one of those is the Speaker, and 24 others are ministers. So effectively what you have is a parliament which meets literally 2 weeks a year. Why? Because they have a majority, the executive controls the legislature, there's no effective oversight, and the numbers of the executive itself so predominate in the legislature that they can get whatever they want in terms of fiscal financial funding with no oversight. And that's what you have more and more in Australian parliaments, a proliferation of various executive offices, whether they be parliamentary secretaryships or outer ministries, or even an expanded ministry across the various parliaments. So how do you separate this? How do you actually get back oversight? Well, what you do is you separate the executive and the legislature fully to say that no member of the executive can serve as part of the legislature. How then do we get the executive? Well, we can't have it selected by the parliament, because then you'll simply fall into the situation where mates will appoint mates. No, you have to have a situation where the executive is selected by that same cohort of people who selects their representatives. And so you move to a directly elected model of president. Now you might say, Phelpsy, that sounds really radical. And it is for Australia. But it's not for another country not so dissimilar to us called the United States of America. And indeed, the traditional Republican model of, little r Republican model, of the United States, in fact, is predicated on the idea that you can't trust anyone in government, which I think is a very healthy attitude to have. So you have the legislature oversighting both the judiciary through its appointment process and the presidency, the president oversighting both the judiciary and the legislature, and the judiciary oversighting both the presidency and the legislature itself. So everyone is looking out to make sure everyone else is not doing the wrong thing. That could happen here. And it almost did happen here in the early Constitutional Convention debates in the 1890s in Australia. There was actually an argument put forward that the Governor-General of Australia should be an elected position. It went down, and it went down pretty badly because everyone understood what that meant. And what did it mean? It meant that the people who had power in the existing legislatures would lose their power. When you are the Premier, you can say, you're supposed to vote this way, and if you vote this way, we'll be looking for you in the next Parliament to be a minister. And in Australia in particular, where you have a predominance of voting blocks, that's an extremely powerful inducement to people not to be too strict in their oversight of the executive. It could happen. It could happen in Australia, and it should happen in Australia. We should move to this system not because we hate the monarchy, but because we love freedom and we want to institutionalise those processes which will maximise freedom by diffusing power and increasing the amount of oversight on the actual power decision-making bodies within society.
Thank you, Peter. I think we all like it when a politician tells us that we can't trust politicians. It makes me wonder whether I should trust that comment. And if you think about that for a while, you'll get very confused. Now that we've heard the three sensible positions, it's time to consider the actual correct position. So please welcome Matt.
So this is a plea to come to the dark side. And the person that's most responsible for this plea is the Darth Vader of the libertarian movement, Hans Hermann Hoppe, and his great book, Democracy, the God That Failed. So basically, why not democracy? Everyone's been told since the dawn of time it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, except sliced bread, of course. But there's a whole bunch of problems with democracy. The first thing is it suffers a significant principal agent problem. We have representative democracy, we don't have participatory democracy. So that means we vote some galoot to actually do what we think they're going to do. But unfortunately in life, what happens is that person's more interested in their own interests than they are in the interests of the people that voted for them. And so you get this problem that they say they might go do something for you, they say they might lower taxes, and then they don't do it. So it's fundamentally at the heart of democracy is this principal agent problem. The second thing is the people who actually vote in democracy, the mob, they're incredibly uninformed. And I include myself in that. I have no idea about half the policies that the government runs, and I'm supposed to know. Voters are rationally ignorant. They don't have time. They've got too many better things in their lives than to spend their time trying to work out what politicians are really trying to sell them. And so what you get these incredible biases in the electorate against sensible policy. So Brian Kaplan, who's an economist, a US economist, he wrote a book called The Myth of the Rational Voter. And he went through surveys and looked at how US voting patterns. And what he basically found was voters have make-work bias. So they're always pro-job type things, even though that they may actually not be producing pro-jobs. That's why things like these tariffs on steel, etc., they're saying here are some jobs in the US, here are some jobs for steel workers in the US. It ignores all the jobs that are lost in other industries in the US. So they've got this bias. They've got an anti-foreign bias. Trade is bad. For some reason, it's all right to trade with someone from Victoria, but it's bad to trade with someone from New Zealand. Don't understand it, makes no logical sense, but the average voter believes it. They've got an anti-market bias. Voluntary transactions apparently are terrible, whereas having some bureaucrat tell you what you're going to spend your money on is apparently a good idea. Again, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And they have a pessimism bias, which most of us have for sure, that we think the past was better than the future in the current day. So so not only are the people who are voting don't have an idea about what they're voting for, even the people that they think are going to do what they think they want them to vote for aren't going to do it anyway. So you've got two levels of illogic running in a democracy. A third issue is democracies inevitably lead to identity politics. Getting control of the government, of political power and the monopoly of violence is very attractive. And the easiest way to get people to get together is as a group of people who have some like interests. So it's not surprising that the Labor Party has consistently been the Catholic Party up until very recently. And Catholics always voted, regardless of their interests, they voted as a group. In countries like Kenya and PNG, etc., you vote along tribal lines. In the US Democrats have not won the white vote since the 1960s. So you get this situation of different identity groups battling against each other rather than looking at the greater good. And finally, on the democracy side, since the end of World War I and the end of absolute monarchies, the hegemony of democracy, you've basically had government consistently getting larger and larger and larger. So the evidence is not there that democracy has been good for liberty. So why the absolute monarchy? And I think that if we ever went to a world
of libertarianism, many of the systems created would be absolute monarchies. You get your Rothschilds or you get your Rockefellers buying some island somewhere and setting up their own little country. And what's the benefit of that? Monarchs, hereditary monarchs, have long-lived visions. Their children are going to run the country in the future. Whereas a politician's worrying about getting re-elected in their 3-year cycles, a monarchy is worried about maximising the value of that country over a long period of time. And so they've got a discipline to do the right thing. And this was actually the case. If you look in the 19th century in some of the absolute monarchs, like for instance the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there was an explosion of new ideas and great things like the Austrian School of Economics, partly because the monarch knew that it was in their interest to have freedom of expression and freedom of ideas. So another really important thing that's quite often ignored is the issue of total war. Total war is largely being pushed from fascist and democratic countries post-World War I. When wars were about two kings getting into an issue, people understood that it was wars between soldiers and it wasn't wars with the populace. And one of the arguments for why the wars have got worse is this issue that these wars are seen as a whole people versus a whole people rather than against one ruling elite and against another. So I say to you that a monarchy, an absolute monarchy, is the only politically legitimate type of country. Because if I go buy myself an island and then I say, here are the rules of the game, you may purchase property on this island, but you must stick to those rules, well then that's a legitimate political mandate. You have made a conscious voluntary decision to live by my rules. No democracy can have that, because the minute you have a democracy, you've got to write a constitution. How do you create a constitution and then get it voted on by the populace and then have half the populace not agree to it? They therefore do not agree with the basic rules of the game. And only in an absolute monarchy can you have that. So, thank you.
Peter, can you check if that mic's working? And Mr. Video Man, you want them to stand up when they answer?
Yes, please.
All right, cool.
Check,
So we're up to the Q&A now. And thankfully, the first two people asked the same question I wanted to ask. So I can pretend I'm asking your question. Pretend I'm nicer than I am. And that is, I think this goes to Satya and Peter the scientist. That's how I'll distinguish between you two from now, okay? Which is, if monarchy is so good, why don't we have an Australian monarchy? Doesn't that answer both of your questions? An Australian monarch. And a subsequent part of that, from some junior research intern, Professor Jason Potts, shouldn't our Australian monarch then be an Indigenous royal family?
Yeah, it alleviates some of the problems. It certainly alleviates the problem of allegiance by having an Australian monarch. But you have this incredible problem that how do you choose the first one? And when we do so, it ultimately comes down to popular consensus, and we'll end up with someone like Schapelle Corby being our first queen. And I don't think that that's a particularly positive outcome. I'd much rather have someone appointed by Parliament.
Should be Shane Warne.
So I want to make a few points. Is it working? Yeah. Yeah, so firstly I should point out that this doesn't, I guess, go against my case because it's still a constitutional monarchy. So there are a few good reasons to keep our monarch where she is in the UK rather than having someone who's Australian. One of the reasons is it increases the degree of her independence and the extent to which she doesn't have skin in our game. Right? We can imagine a possible future where the royal family through intermarriage or whatever ends up having, let's say, a social, someone who's a social justice warrior, who's the most un-Australian person you can imagine. But because she has a British monarchy's history behind them, they will have to act in accordance with tradition and do their duty normally. So there is a good reason to do that. The second thing is, the idea of having an Australian monarch is actually quite interesting. I have heard someone proposing that, there's an Australian woman who married the Danish king, I think, and they said we should take one of those kids and make it an Australian king. I think it's quite interesting. It's quite a fun idea to look at. Regarding, but obviously for the reasons I mentioned before, it's not the ideal situation. Regarding whether it should be an Indigenous person, well look, we've had 80,000 years of indigenous history in this continent. That's very much true. But where do our institutions actually come from, right? Is there something we can identify in our society as we understand it today that has direct roots in indigenous culture and in indigenous societies? And the answer is actually, unfortunately, it's very little. I quite like the idea of indigenous tribes having a treaty system with the federal government, rather than things that they currently have, such as native title, because I think that'll give them more self-determination. And it'll allow them to continue their culture as it's been for over 60,000 years. But the idea of subsuming all of us who have no affinity to indigenous culture of our own under an indigenous monarch it's not acknowledging history, it's rewriting history. So that's why it's practically not a good idea.
Thank you. I think this one is for Peter the Polly. As we can't trust anyone in government, as you rightly say, if our constitution was to be dissolved and rewritten, what's the likelihood that it'll be a catalyst for losing more rights rather than gaining a better constitution?
I think that would be very high, actually. Very high. I have approached this from a theoretical perspective because I know that there is no institution which willingly gives up power. The only institution which can make a change to the Constitution is the Parliament of Australia. And the Parliament of Australia is already on a very good wicket with the existing Westminster system. So there's no way that they're going to diminish their power by instituting a system which will take power away from them. So the answer is, you're right. It's almost certain that any new constitution would be worse than the one that we already have, but you never know, you could dream.
Fair enough. And for Peter the Scientist, how is a royal family collecting taxpayer money not an argument against any sort of politician? Aren't all politicians technically dole bludgers?
Yeah, they are, some more than others. However, it's also a matter of magnitude. For the royal family, it's on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars. For an individual politician, well, I don't know how much you earn, but it's not hundreds of millions of dollars. So the scale is entirely different. But yes, I agree. Politicians are certainly dole bludgers in a sense, but at least they're doing a job. Whereas royalty, their only real interest is furthering their own cause. I wouldn't call that a job. I wouldn't call that a positive contribution to society. I would call that self-interest and nothing further.
My argument would be different, and that is that the monarchy doesn't legislate, doesn't produce any laws, and doesn't produce any regulations, and so in that respect is doing a far greater service than most politicians.
Yeah, I should point something out. It's actually a misconception that the royal family are dole bludgers. Under an agreement made a few hundred years ago, the government of the UK pays the royal family a token rent in exchange for the use of Crown property. And under the Sovereign Act of 2011, the government of the UK makes over £350 million every year off Crown estates and off Crown property. So they're a massive net profit. Yeah, they're literally oppressed. And they're happy to be oppressed. That's crazy. Which politician have you heard who does that? Yeah. Also, regarding the royal wedding, that was mostly paid for by private funding from the Private Heritage Trust and so on. The only public funding was for security costs, but technically that's the model we use for football matches and other public events. So how is this any different? Right? So that argument doesn't stand up.
So what you're saying is the royal families aren't dole bludgers, they're Ronald McDonald. That's...
Exactly.
Okay. For Mats, with your model of anarcho-monarchism, is Liechtenstein a good example, or nearly a good example?
Yeah, Liechtenstein's very good. It's got the added feature of creating even more legitimacy because they allow secession. And that is a very important point. Whereas when I was arguing, if I bought an island, I wish I could, but if I bought an island, then if you moved onto my property, I could set the property rights. In Liechtenstein, this guy's actually decided that I'll give you the opportunity to actually leave our political system whenever you like, and you can effectively be your own little country. So it's a great little addition to the idea.
And Liechtenstein's one of only 2 countries in the world named after a family, the family name von Liechtenstein. Try and work out the other one and ask me later if you can't work it out. Yeah, okay. All right, so you can work it out already. Well done. Okay, so for Phelps, do you support electing judges as well? If not, why not?
At lower court level, yeah, absolutely. I would love to see a magistracy which is elected at the lower court level and also be forced to live in the community in which they're adjudicating. That would be, because you can't all live in Vaucluse if you're, looking at street offences in Western Sydney. So yeah, I'd love to see a regional and localised focus for the judiciary, but failing that, I think an appointment model where you have a proposal by the executive and ratification by the legislature at the higher levels of the judiciary meets exactly the sort of checks and balances which you need to making sure that some idiot doesn't get elected to the judiciary, at the same time does not allow for excessive politicisation by the executive, which is exactly what you have in Australia at the moment.
Okay, another one for you, Matt. An excuse to rant about public choice theory if you want. How come when you're a consumer you're rational, but when you're a voter you're not?
It's a good point. And the reason is because the cost of getting enough information to be an informed voter outweighs the benefit. So Gordon Tullock went through a voting model that basically said that every single person that goes and votes is wasting their time. And so until you get to a point that there's enough people not bothering to go vote, and therefore then your vote actually makes a meaningful difference in an electorate, there's no actual point in voting. And so if that is actually the case, and in Australia it's even worse because they make you go. Mind you, I haven't been since 1996. I'm very proud of that. So what you do is you get off the roll and then you just never get back on. And so therefore they can't fine you. Because you're only fined if you're on the roll and don't go to vote. But anyway. So basically there's the opportunity cost of getting informed isn't worth it for the average person.
I know this isn't supposed to be my panel, but I'll quibble a little bit. The theory is actually that voters are rational to be ignorant. The argument isn't that voters are irrational, they are rationally ignorant. So they're rational in both instances, you just get more informed about things that you can actually influence. So, Satya was asked if you could respond to Rhodey's point, but you've already done that. Have you got any more questions coming in? Oh, sorry, this is one for everyone. Do you think Australia's interests, this is a slight change of topic, but do you think Australia's interests would be better served by debating the removal of upper houses from state parliaments? Or I guess you could extend that to the Senate, but anyway. Should you all take the Queensland model?
I don't like that idea. I think the Senate serves a very important function in Australia. I think one of our biggest problems is when you become an MP, to some degree you have to abandon your principles almost completely, and it becomes a rent-seeking, pork-barreling game, because it's in your interest to keep seeking more of the public purse for your own constituency. I mean, as a self-interested politician, that's what you have to do. When you're in the Senate, you actually have the ability to advocate on principled policy stances, even informally through your role in the media. You know, some of the biggest champions for liberty in this country, actually almost all of them, have not been in the lower house. They've been Senator Lionhelm, Senator James Paterson, Senator Tim Wilson, and a whole bunch of MLCs, including Peter Phelps here. Oh, whoops. But anyway, look, he's a minority in that respect. Yeah. So yeah, I don't think that's a good idea. The only advantage that I can see to having just one house is, of course, it makes it a lot easier to get things done. Tough decisions have to be made sometimes. It's been so difficult to cut down public spending and therefore enable tax cuts, real tax cuts in the future, because it just is too hard to get tax cuts passed through both upper and lower houses. But other than that, I think costs versus benefits, I would want to keep the upper house.
Well, I'm prepared to give up the senates in the states if we make every state about a quarter of its size and we get rid of local government. So ultimately, it's about diffusion of power and it's about checks on power. And so the problem with, as Satya has talked about, the problem with not having a Senate is it's just it makes it just that little bit easier for the bastards to take stuff from us. And I would rather that they didn't. So I'm prepared to negotiate with anyone who wants to get rid of Senates, but I want another check in place.
This question comes to me quite often, actually. I say, why not get rid of lower houses? The great advantage of which is that you in fact get rid of 2/3 of politicians rather than 1/3 of politicians. So you're left only with one house of roughly 1/3 of the size of the current parliament. But there's another thing to do about that, and that is what you're essentially saying is let's get rid of the upper house and only have a lower house where the executive already predominates. And I would ask you to throw your mind back to the beloved reign of Sir Johannes Bjelke Petersen in Queensland and the wonderful enlightened libertarian approach which he took towards a whole range of social issues, including banning demonstrations, corruption generally speaking. Bicameral parliaments are not perfect, but my view is that they're a hell of a lot better than unicameral parliaments, especially in a system where the executive is drawn from that legislature.
So I'm not completely radical on either direction. I'm a little bit on the fence on this. I do see the benefit in having checks and balances, obviously. There are very, very clear examples of why this is a good thing to have. But I do believe that in general, having multiple houses of parliament, you could do a thought experiment and say, well, let's add 3, 4, 5. What happens to government each time you do that? It becomes less efficient and less able to actually get anything done whatsoever. And sometimes you want to say, well, maybe it'd be better to have a government that we didn't necessarily agree with on anything, but at least they got things done, rather than have so many checks and balances in place so that the whole thing comes to an absolute standstill. And if you have one group of people in power in one House of Parliament, another group of people in the other House of Parliament, there's a very real risk that the whole thing comes to absolute gridlock and nothing gets done whatsoever.
But the government couldn't do anything. Another question from everyone's favourite blockchain intern. Secession, is it awesome or just really great?
Yeah, it can be really fun. You know, I support the right of anyone who is a net tax recipient to secede. Unfortunately, that's probably not going to happen. So,
You can secede from my kingdom at any time, provided you pay the right amount of money for it. That's all right, no worries. There's definitely an exit fee. I'll put an exit fee on my on the rules within the kingdom. So yeah, succession's great.
I don't know if everyone needs to do this one unless you have a strong opinion, but all right. Satya, someone's asked for you specifically. Blame Schneider. Can you please respond to Rhodey's charge that in a changing world there may be risks to having allegiance with another country's head of state in the future? Like the UK might be good now, but what happens when the UK is fully taken over by insert whatever group you don't like? Will we still want their head of state?
Well, I made the point earlier that that's highly unlikely to happen because of all the years of tradition and, you know, the conventions that are built up over, you know, centuries. Look, in the unlikely event it does happen someday, we can have a referendum and we can get out of it. And the royal family and the monarchy are not going to stop us. They're the one allegiance to a foreign country that really doesn't care and isn't going to do it. We can trust them on that much at the very least. But yeah, practically speaking, it's highly unlikely to happen. If it does happen, we'll deal with it 1,000 years from now.
All right, just one really quick question for everyone here, and then we might give you all a minute to wrap it up since this is supposed to be a debate. You can get in your little rebuttals. Really quick question. If you weren't to pick your side of the argument, which other side of this argument of the four here do you find the least offensive or most persuasive?
The least offensive. I find the most offensive stuff is the most fun to argue. So I would probably go with absolute monarchy because it would be really fun to argue that point.
I mean, what do you believe?
What I believe? I guess appointed president just because it's closest to my case that isn't my case.
Yeah, I'm a constitutional monarchist because creating a government is really, really hard. And as much as I like to complain about how bad Australia's is, it's still massively better than most places in the world. So we have to be very, very careful and very, very sure that the changes we're going to make are actually going to improve the system. And I've yet to be convinced, and Dr. Phelps' argument earlier that he felt that they wouldn't do the right thing anyway, makes me even more convinced of that.
If I can't have an elected president, then I'll do the next best thing to ensure the diffusion of power and have a constitutional monarchy with a monarch as far away from Australia as humanly possible.
So I have to say this debate has completely changed my opinion on this whole issue. I think that of all of the arguments I've heard today, the absolute monarchist had the strongest arguments. So I'm inclined to agree with him on this. One observation you can make, and I'm not saying that you have to support authoritarian governments, but one observation you can definitely make is that authoritarian governments do have a tendency to get things done. If you look at the really successful economies in the world, like China versus India, which one is more successful? Look at Singapore versus neighbouring democracies, much more successful. So I think this whole idea of having an authoritarian government, well, no. I don't actually have a good rebuttal to that. I'll just say no. But you can definitely make the conclusion that authoritarian governments do get things done much more efficiently, and so an absolute monarchy, I think, is the second best option.
Apparently we've got a question. So Peter, so I love the American system of gridlock. It's actually quite awesome, but I wonder about, isn't our system to an extent have the gridlock by meaning that the Governor-General Queen has all these powers that they can't actually use. And so it's like the sword of Damocles over the political system.
The answer to that is that the Queen has no power. The Queen and the Governor-General have no power. The power lies with the executive being able to tell the Queen or the Governor-General or the Governor what the law is that they have to sign. So you ask what's not the symbolic head of power, where does actual power lie? And as libertarians or classical liberals or anarcho-liberals or whatever, we should be asking ourselves, who's got the power? Why do they have the power? Is it a legitimate use of power? And how can we constrain that power? What you have at the current time is a lack of constraint on power. Whereas under proposed system, at least you would have clear defining lines which would offer countervailing powers to the existing structure.
Just a quick rebuttal on that. What about the power to veto legislation and the reserve powers?
This is often a cause a criticism of the American system, and that is you get congressional gridlock. There's a way around it, and there's a way which is identified by Reagan, and that is to have a line item veto, so that you wouldn't actually have to veto an entire bill. You could simply veto sections of it. So you could say, we're not supporting this. So each line would be able to be vetoed by the president. Of course, if you say, well, how do you get over a despotic president just arbitrarily vetoing things? Well, then you have the override of the veto. 60% of both houses of the US Congress, 60% of the Parliament would do the same thing here. So you could have, again, a check on the power of the legislature by the president, and then you'd have a check on the president's excessive use of power by the legislature back again. Again, checks and balances to make sure that despotism is not enacted either by a president or by a legislature.
All right, just finishing up there, 1 minute each, 30 seconds to 1 minute, final rant, making your case. And then I think we'll try and find some way to get everyone to vote after this. Maybe not in person, but all right. You know your own argument?
I think I've pretty much summed up most of the arguments. So I guess I'll just remind everyone, taxation is theft.
So, yeah, you've stolen my thunder, but that's all right. So I'll just very quickly say, look, the monarch understands the Laffer curve. That's very important. They're only going to tax to the maximum point. So that's good. The monarch wants to protect your property because they don't like getting their shit stolen either. They don't... The monarch doesn't like crime. They don't like dying either. And most importantly, the monarch will rape and pillage. There's no doubt about that. But there's only one of them, or a family of them. There's a lot of us. We can kill them. Very, very, very hard to kill the rule. Very, very hard to kill the mob. Thank you.
Final comment. Never trust a politician and never trust a system which increases their power.
Yeah, so my final point would be that, as we've discussed earlier, if you have an elected president, you lead to potential confusion in who has power and who needs to be taken seriously. For this reason, it's obvious that the way to alleviate this problem is by having an absolute monarch.
All right, thank you, Over. Thank you for that all. Schneider recommended a good way for us to be able to determine who wins this. If you could go to the Hoover app and vote by comment on this session. Just vote in, I don't know, which one you believe in or which one you thought was most persuasive. Oh, just whatever you want to vote.